I'll stay.
Thank you. Will you monitor participants and stuff?
Yep.
Thank you, ma'am. And will you start recording?
Yeah, when do you want me to start? When you start?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. We're going to wait just a couple more minutes to give folks a chance to pop in. And while we're waiting, if you would like to introduce yourselves to each other in the chat, feel free to do that. Let folks know what organization you're with, where you're listening from, and anything else you'd like them to know today. And Karen, if you'd let me know when kind of the waiting room is cleared out, or we have a pause, and I'll go ahead and get started.
So Tamara, I can't actually access the waiting room. So I don't know.
Okay, sorry.
Oh no, well, you're fine.
Let's go ahead and get started then. I want to welcome everyone to the Interpreting Difficult History webinar. My name is Tamara Hemmerlein, and I'll be presenting today. But before we get started with the webinar itself, I do want to let everybody know that we're recording this program, and we will have a link that I can send you if you would like it. Is at some point by the end of this week. You'll also receive an evaluation link and a follow-up email. And so if you wouldn't mind filling that out for us, it lets us know how we're doing and ways we can improve, and maybe other topics that would be of interest for our trainings. So if you're not familiar with Zoom, or even if you are and need a little bit of a refresher, I do want to let you know that we are doing this as a webinar today. And so what you'll see on your screen is a chat function, and that's so you can chat with your fellow participants. You could also send messages to the panelists privately. And then we do have a Q&A function. And so if you have some questions about content or anything like that, go ahead and pop those in the Q&A box. We will be monitoring that. As a matter of fact, I'll go ahead and let Karen introduce herself because she'll be doing the monitoring. So Karen,
of course.
Who are you?
So my name is Karen DePau. I am the manager of Local History Services. I primarily deal with the collections-based things that Local History Services does. So everything from our collections advisor monthly newsletter to collections care site visits, which you can still do. We're just doing them virtually, and really anything else that involves collections. So I will be hanging out here, second sharing Tamara's webinar. Once we kind of get started, I will disappear, but I'll still be lurking around in the background. I'll mostly be just collecting questions so that we can make sure that if questions come up during the webinar, that Tamara sees them at the end and she doesn't have to try to do too many things at once and can focus in on the webinar. So you'll see me again at the end of this whole shindig.
Thanks, Karen. So, my name is Tamara Hemmerlein. I'm the Director of Local History Services at the Indiana Historical Society. We are a field service office, which means we provide professional development opportunities, consultations, virtual site visits, and for Indiana's heritage organizations. We work with museums, libraries, archives, historical societies, historic sites, organizations that touch history or heritage. We work with them in Indiana. I do want to thank the Indiana Historical Society for being so supportive of our local heritage organizations. And I do, for the folks who are not visiting from, who are not from Indiana organizations, who are visiting from elsewhere, I do want to encourage you to go to the American Association for State and Local History website and look for the Field Services Alliance. It's an affinity group and it's made up of field service offices and officers across the country. You can look to see if your organization or your area, your state has a field service office listed, and all field service offices exist to literally serve our colleagues and peer institutions in our areas and across the country. So welcome here today. I want to give you a little bit of information about myself because it is pertinent to what we're going to talk about later, and for you to kind of know the perspective or the lens that I am bringing to this conversation and to my museum work. I'm a white, middle-class, cis woman with roots in Kentucky and Indiana. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I have a master's degree in medieval Spanish literature with Golden Age Spanish literature, conquest literature, and women's studies as areas of focus. I'm a veteran of the Indiana Air National Guard, where I served as a medical admin in a tactical clinic. I've worked in and with small to mid-sized museums for 22 years. I live in a small, mainly rural community in central Indiana. I'm going to acknowledge a strong bias that I have right now because it is part of how I see things and part of what I've had to work and continue to work to overcome, both in my personal life, professional service, and in my career. I have a relatively strong bias about older men who very often in my life have not seen me as belonging in the spaces where I work, and sometimes see the types of organizations I work with as less important than larger organizations. I work primarily with small institutions in small communities. When I go into a situation, one of the things that I have to be aware of about my bias is that I expect resistance from older men. And I really have to think about how I'm going to put that aside so that I can work well and communicate better with the organizations that I serve. I can trace my bias to experiences I had in graduate school, in the military, and in my museum career. So as I want to acknowledge those things as part of the lens that I have as I work through this webinar. So today, what we'll talk about is how heritage organizations can thoughtfully and intentionally interpret history, even when the history is hard. So hopefully you'll leave the webinar with some ways you can help your staff and volunteers learn how to tell difficult stories and some understanding of why visitors may not want to hear those stories. The first thing I want to talk about is difficult history itself and sort of a definition of that term. That difficult history addresses issues of social injustice, oppression, and violence. Those examples may vary from community to community. There may be a lot of those issues happening in any one community. You may not be able to perceive those issues in your community. You may have to think differently and think a little harder and say, here's where those are happening in my community. Another thing, as you're working with difficult history, as you're thinking about how to define difficult history in your community for your organization and work, is to be aware that difficult history can be a contested term. Some folks are very comfortable using it. Other folks are not comfortable sort of labeling histories as difficult. I've had conversations with folks and they say, when you label my history as difficult history, you are also saying that there is something about me that is problematic. That if my history is difficult, you are signaling that I am difficult or my community is difficult. It can set up the expectation that the conversation is already going to be hard, that it is already going to be problematic before you even start the conversation. And it may, in line with kind of labeling communities, history is difficult, it may sort of make somebody feel like they are other. They are not part of a larger community. So just be aware of that when you're thinking about using the term difficult history. That being said, it is the term that I'm going to use throughout this webinar because at this point, it seems to be the best term, but it is a conversation to have and something we're grappling with as a profession. So the other thing to think about is when you are talking about or thinking about changing your interpretation and addressing difficult histories, there are some basic tasks that you need to be aware of as heritage organizations. You need to acknowledge that history is not simple or one-sided. There are all sorts of perspectives and all sorts of lived experiences in our communities. So the way that I experience a historical event may be very, very different from the way my next door neighbor experiences that event or my daughter experiences that event. And so we need to look at multiple perspectives and come at history from many sides. As heritage organizations, we need to look for and find solid historical evidence. What we say and what we do is important. There are surveys, there are evaluations that tell us that our visitors trust us, that our visitors have expectations that what we say and what we do in our organizations will be based on research and historical evidence. So we need to make sure that we are searching those things out as we move forward. We also need to participate in community conversations. We need to leave our buildings. We need to leave our grounds. We need to virtually leave our homes and participate in larger community conversations. Don't forget to go beyond the ones that you host or sponsor, or maybe even those that seem directly related to your work as a heritage organization. That will help you find other perspectives. That will help you find those unexpected stories, or maybe those places where there is a difficult history that you didn't recognize or didn't really know about prior to attending those meetings. We need to encourage open, civil, and honest discourse. That's important. We need to say, we need to talk about this. We have this information. We have this reliable information. We hold collections, we hold stories. And so we need to encourage discussion and then give our input based on what we know. And I would say one of the most important things as heritage organizations we need to do is listen and learn. We do a whole lot of talking as heritage organizations. I think one of the things that we need to do better is listen. And you know, we're doing better at that. But then also we need to learn from what we've heard, and we need to learn how to use what we have heard in a way that benefits our communities. So here's a question for everyone. And if you feel comfortable, please put some of your responses in the chat box to this question. Why is talking about difficult history important? Why should we be doing it? And that's something that I want you to think about for the rest of the webinar. How is it important? Why do we need to talk about it? And as things occur to you, go ahead and put those in the chat. Karen, if you could let me know some of the things that are showing up there, that would be great. And I'll give you a little bit, maybe a minute to put some things in that chat.
All right, do you want me to just read them out, Tamara?
That would be awesome, Karen.
All right. It acknowledges what happened in your organization's history. You can't come from a place of authenticity without acknowledging who you are and where you came from. If we don't talk about difficult history, who will fill that void? It's difficult because oftentimes white, cisgendered, straight individuals make it outside of the norm.
All right. Thank you, Karen. So those are all really good. And thank you for sharing your input. It is important for us to talk about difficult history because we do collect. We're in the business of collecting the history. We're in the business of sharing that history. And I wholeheartedly agree with the comment, you know, if we're not going to do it, who is? And so I think that is very important. But I will say that talking about difficult history is in and of itself a hard thing for us to do because it involves acknowledging that maybe we haven't done such a good job with that in the past. And we have to look at some things that are painful and tragic and, you know, very, very, very hard to look at. We also need to talk about and interpret difficult history because we need to increase diversity and inclusion in our organizations. We need to tell more diverse stories and we need to work to counter stereotypes. And looking at all perspectives and all sides of a story help us to do those things. Helps us build trust. So one of the things that I like to remind people of when we're learning to increase our diversity and inclusion, when we're working towards that, when we're learning to tell difficult histories, we can't assume trust. Organizations, a lot of times just barrel ahead. We mean well. We want to benefit our communities and we just sort of push forward and we look to establish partnerships and collaborations. Sometimes we need to slow down and we need to say, all right, how can we build trust? We assume people will welcome us with open arms. That's not always the case. You need to go in, you need to listen, you need to learn and not barrel ahead and always talk or say, this is what we want to do, this is what we want to do. You need to step back and say, what do you need from us? And sometimes that answer is actually nothing right now. And sometimes that answer is glad you asked. Again, consider those multiple perspectives. And when you're doing that, ensure representation. Be sure to elevate the stories of people who have traditionally been marginalized or underrepresented. Give people ownership over their own stories. Invite, encourage, and share common community-generated content, and advocate for the preservation of places and stories that need to be told. I'll give you an example from an experience that I had in the past. I was part of a leadership academy, and one of the things we did was take a tour of historic sites in the county. And one of the places we visited was a normal school that had been saved and preserved and was being used as a community center. One of the individuals in our group, who was African American, I noticed she didn't come in with the rest of us. Everyone else was white. And she was standing there and she was crying. And I went back out and I asked what was wrong. I wondered if someone had said something to her. And she said to me, I have heard people say over and over again on this tour, isn't it great to walk where these people have walked? Isn't it great to be in the school where so many people learned to teach? Things like that. And she said, I don't have a place like that in this county. My community, the African American community, doesn't have a place where they can walk where hundreds of years of ancestors have walked. Those places for us weren't important enough to be preserved. And I think that's a really powerful thing to think about, because when the field trip was planned, things like that weren't taken into consideration. And the effect that it would have on that individual, on Vicki, wasn't even taken into consideration. It wasn't part of the thought process. So the folks who were organizing future field trips really thought about that and thought about how to talk about that. Not only how to talk about the places in the county that had been preserved, but also the places in the county that had been lost and why those places were lost and what the long-term effect was on community members. When you are looking to increase representation, when you are looking to tell more of those stories, there are some things you need to be aware of. You need to be careful with labels that people did not give themselves. So Vicki, the woman that I was talking about earlier, preferred not to call herself African American. She prefers to call herself Black. So that is something that when I am talking to Vicki, when I am talking about Vicki, when I'm in meetings with Vicki, I keep that in mind, because that is how she has chosen to identify herself. And that's something very important to be aware of and to talk to people about. What would what is their preferred address? What are their preferred pronouns? What are their preferred identification? Also, you need to personalize the stories. When you are talking about stories, when you're talking about any kind of history, say the names. Don't just say people or this individual or enslaved people. If you know the names, say the names. Don't erase people by not saying their names. Don't use the passive voice. Acknowledge individual agency. Acknowledge that people had control over their actions, good and bad. Talk about real experiences. Confront myths and stereotypes, and the things like saying names, not using passive voice, acknowledging agency. Those acts, those decisions that you make help to confront myths and stereotypes. And also, as you are doing that, think about ways you can facilitate meaningful and intentional discussions. You're also going to need to think about shifting from transactional relationships to organizational transformation. You have to be intentional about diversity and inclusion. It doesn't just happen. It is not, you know, diversity inclusion, real diversity inclusion won't just fall in your lap. You have to be very intentional about it, and you have to make conscious decisions about diversity and inclusion. Invite everyone to the table, ask them to come, hear what they're saying, actively listen to what they're saying, and then act on their advice. And I would say it is very important at that table to acknowledge institutional privilege. We have the resources to tell the stories we tell because of the stories we have chosen to tell very often. If we are telling a story about, you know, a great white man, and those are the kinds of stories people are coming to us with, those are, then we're just going to keep telling those stories. Also, in terms of collecting, there is institutional privilege there. Very often our collections are filled with objects from sort of the dominant community, not the marginalized community, because very often those dominant communities are the ones that were able to save things. They are the ones that were able to use something but not use it up. Very often marginalized communities were in the position to use up their objects. So very often we don't have those physical examples or physical representations of their story or difficult stories. Think about my friend Vicky, who said our places weren't important enough to preserve. The African-American places, the Black places in my community weren't important enough to preserve. So think about how privilege plays out in the stories we choose to tell and the objects we are able to collect. Avoid condescension when you're at that table. I heard somebody say once, we don't need somebody who's going to come and shine the light of their knowledge on podunk. You know, because a well-meaning institution had gone in and said, here's what we would like to do. We would like to tell your story. And the folks at the table said, great, but you need to let us be part of that. We need to have a real voice in telling our own story. And there were some things to overcome because it felt very condescending to the folks who were invited to the table. Also, understand that as we are working to gather more information so that we can tell difficult histories, we need to examine our own relationships with different groups in our community. A lot of times those relationships have been transactional. Can you help us with this exhibit? Can you help us with this program? Can you share your knowledge with us? And then once that exhibit is done, once that program is over, our relationship stops. We have benefited. We have let them share their story with us. We have done the exhibit or the program that is about their history, and then it's over. Real transformational relationships, real organizational transformation happens when you establish those relationships, when you work hard at that listening and you really bring those groups into your organization and you involve them beyond that exhibit or that program. So if you are working, say on a program, an LGBT plus program, and you invite folks from the LGBT plus community into your space, invite them to your table, then think about in a program that isn't an LGBT plus program, how can you still keep those voices at the table? How can you make sure that you are engaging those individuals and those groups in all aspects of your organization, not just when you need them for the program and the exhibit? I think that once you have that, once you have really thought about kind of a universal story or a big idea or the big connection, and you are bringing a lot of different voices to every table across your institution, then you're on your way to real transformation and transformational relationships. When you start talking about difficult history, you have to accept that it is uncomfortable. You are asking people and your organization, and when I say people, I mean staff, volunteers, members, donors, visitors, anyone who is connected to your organization, you are asking them to question their existing knowledge and sometimes their core beliefs. You are saying, these things that you were taught in school, these things that museums have said in the past, have this other side to them. There is this other story to them. For a story about George Washington as the first US president, there is a story about George Washington as a slave owner. Both stories are part of his history. Both stories have affected then and affect now people all over the place. And so when you start bringing in those aspects that can feel negative or can feel as if you are sort of knocking down a myth or something like that about a person, a place, or an event, you are saying to people, this is destabilizing, or you have to acknowledge that it's destabilizing. It requires a different kind of listening and understanding. It requires you to understand what your biases are. It requires you to work to put those aside or to work through them and to see how your biases and your personal biases, your professional biases, your organizational biases are affecting what you're saying and doing and interpreting. And you have to step outside and step back and say, here's what I need to do to really understand what I'm going to talk about in terms of difficult history. And very often it can bring negative feelings to the surface. So in my research, I actually relied very heavily on the Interpreting History series by Rowman and Littlefield, Rowman and Littlefield. And one of the things that I really found myself putting a lot of thought and thinking a lot about was Julia Rose's Interpreting Difficult History at Museums and Historic Sites and the Commemorative Museum Pedagogy. It is a psychoanalytic approach to engaging visitors in exhibits with difficult knowledge. And she breaks it down into 5 phases. And they're listed here in a way that looks like they're sort of one step leads into the other, step leads into the other, and they sort of do, but also this is actually nonlinear. Folks may go from reception to reflection to resistance to repetition. They may not actually go through the phases as in the order they're listed here. So reception is, somebody is at your exhibit, they read the label, they are there to learn, they are there to experience something at your museum, they're there to hang out with friends and it just happens to be at a museum. They are clicking into your website into a virtual program or a virtual exhibit. They are there to receive information in some way. And if the information that they are looking at, if the label they're reading, if the image they're seeing deals with difficult history, then they, at that point, may think, oh no, that's not what happened. That can't be true. That I can't believe that. And they may be resistant to learning more. They may shut down. They may say, I can't do that. In an exhibit about Native American history, they may run across that label or that drawing or that first person account of Indian removal. They may run across something like the word genocide. And at that point, they may say, I can't. Their resistance may be sort of disbelief. It may actually be, I can't emotionally have that moment right now with this exhibit or the program. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll repeat things that they see, or they will say something about the image. And that is sort of a way for them to try and come to grips with the information they have. Very often they'll think about it. They may think about it during the rest of their visit, whether it's on-site or virtual. They may think about it once they get home. And then hopefully, if we have done our job in terms of presenting difficult history and talking about it in a way that acknowledges the difficulties that people have with hearing difficult history, they'll reconsider. That's, what would be great is for someone who was resistant about the United States and boarding schools for Native Americans who came into an exhibit thinking, yeah, school, it's great, education is great. And then through the course of the exhibit, they understand or start to see or learn that those schools had to do with a race and culture. And then they can think about it and they can say, okay, now I can get to a place where I can think about it and I can maybe change. I can change what I thought about Native Americans and boarding schools. I can change what I thought about a relationship between Native Americans and the United States. So think about that, and kind of think about the commemorative museum pedagogy as you're looking at interpreting difficult history. You're also going to need to understand implicit bias. All of us have biases. It doesn't make us bad people. It doesn't make us recognizing them can make us better people, or at least be able to communicate and understand better. Our brains are hardwired to organize and categorize information without our awareness. It's what used to keep us alive. It's what made us learn and understand threats and know how to deal with them. Now, what that means is we can form unconscious judgments without even realizing it. So in any discussion you're having, as you start to have discussions about tackling difficult history at your organizations, focus on seeing individuals, not sort of broad brush generalizations of communities. Focus on individuals. Think about what I said earlier, say the names, focus on agency, individual agency. Adjust our perspective, recognize our biases, focus on seeing the individuals, and then say, all right, here's what I need to do to change that. Here's how I can move forward. And then very consciously work to change our stereotypes. Very consciously work to change what we come into a conversation or a situation thinking, and the generalities that we hold, and the biases that we hold. As you work with difficult history and the things that are connected to interpreting difficult history, it is important to understand how to work with visitors, staff, and volunteers, anyone who is connected to your organization. You need to acknowledge everyone brings biases and past experiences to the table. In my introduction, I told you some of my past experiences. I told you what one of my biases are, and that's not the only one. It's just the one I chose for this webinar. Recognize all of us bring that to the table, the people we're communicating with and ourselves. Give people the opportunity to safely opt out. And that opting out may be temporary or permanent, but let them know that there are points in the process where it is okay for them to opt out. Also, know when it is not okay for people to opt out. Be clear where those points are and what the non-negotiables are. As you tell difficult history, there may be parts that people say, I need to step back, I need to think, I need to reconcile myself. Maybe they're going through those phases of the commemorative museum pedagogy. Give them an opportunity to work through that, and let them kind of determine when they need to take a step back, when they need to opt out. If you have someone who wants to permanently opt out of talking about a difficult history, then as an organization, you have decisions to make. Is it okay for someone to permanently opt out of that story, of telling that story or being part of that program or that exhibit, or is it not? Be clear about that. Those are those non-negotiables. Understand not everyone is going to agree. They're not going to agree from the beginning. They may not even agree at the end. What hopefully you will come to is a point where everybody understands how telling difficult history and talking about difficult histories benefits the organization and, more importantly, benefits the communities that we serve. Think about bringing in outside facilitators and moderators. That may be something that is necessary for your organization. Kind of take the pulse before you start talking about changing your interpretation and talking about including difficult histories, and know where sort of the stress points are going to be, know where the hot buttons are, and determine whether you can bring in or should bring in outside moderators and facilitators. If you are the one who is going to be doing the training or working on the interpretive change, be really honest with yourself about where your own hot buttons are. Where are you likely to dig in? Where are you likely to have personal resistance to people who may be going through the feelings of resistance themselves? And know where you need to step back from the process and handle logistics and things like that, but maybe you're not leading the conversations. Understand that there are going to be barriers when you start having conversations about including difficult history. People have past experiences that they're going to bring to the table. The new information may shock them. It may shock some folks that other people didn't know about that history. It may bring up feelings of guilt and shame. You may have folks that are apathetic. They're sort of like, yeah, okay, it's a thing. Understand what the risks are. People will have personal feelings of risk, and there may be organizational risk involved. Identify those risks before you start having this conversation. And know that these conversations may destabilize how people understand their world. It may rock their world in a way that feels really negative or sad or shameful. Understand that and be willing to help folks work through that. Help them work through these feelings and break through, hopefully break through the barriers. When you're doing the training itself, again, I can't emphasize this strongly enough, acknowledge biases, know your own, ask people to look at their own, ask them to be honest about what their biases are. That doesn't mean that they have to share them. I opted to share one of mine, but not everybody is going to be comfortable doing that. Acknowledge they exist, ask people to think about them and acknowledge them. Don't ask them to say them out loud, because there is risk. There is risk in saying, I have a bias about older white men, because some of the folks listening to this webinar may fit within that group. And you know, I don't think older white men are horrible people, you know, but in saying I have a bias, I am risking that someone listening to this webinar may kind of shut down a bit because I have that bias. Prepare very intentionally for frank and open conversations. Again, bring in an outside facilitator if you need to. Talk about why the interpretation is changing to include difficult stories. Why this story? Why now? What is the impact we hope to have as an organization on the community by making this choice now in this moment? Give people time to reflect and reconsider. Give them some time to think through this. Don't start the conversation at 10 a.m. in the morning and expect somebody by 11 a.m. to have worked through all of their biases and barriers and be comfortable with the difficult history. We need time. We need to be kind to ourselves and each other and give and recognize that it takes time to come to grips with difficult histories. Create a list of concerns and be accountable for working towards solutions. Ask folks, what are your concerns? If we make this interpretive change now, if we start including this history at this moment, what are the concerns? Folks may actually see some risks that you didn't see, and those may be risks that you need to really think through in terms of your organization. And be accountable for working towards solutions. Don't ask people to make a list of concerns and then just sort of set that list aside and say, yep, we made the list. Think about how you can work towards solutions for those concerns. Develop a list of resources for folks and think broadly. Look at resources that have to do with pedagogical theories. Look at resources that have to do with self-care. Resources for data folks. You know, look at some surveys and evaluations and things that are going on right now in our profession about what visitors' expectations are and what sort of levels of tolerance they have for difficult histories. How willing are they to support us as we work to tell a fuller story? And then teach strategies for recognizing resistance and helping visitors through their processes. As staff and volunteers, we're going to be working through the same kinds of processes, the same kind of barriers, phases of acceptance, reception as our visitors. So if we learn to help each other through the processes, we can actually then learn to help our visitors through the process. And that's really important. So teach folks strategies, teach strategies for active listening, teach strategies for good conversation facilitation, teach de-escalation techniques, and keep focused on, we're going to tell this difficult story. We know that visitors are going to have trouble with it. Here's what we can do to make that situation as comfortable as it can be, and hopefully bring our visitors to that point of reconsideration. So we're also going to need to talk about the interpretive change. I said earlier, why do you need to tell this story right now? What is changing about your interpretation? And what impact do you want the story to have? Those are big questions to ask. I think you run the risk of doing a disservice to the difficult story itself if you don't answer these questions. If you can't say, here's why we're doing this, beyond because we should. Well, why should you? Karen has a technique that we use in local history services that she uses on us in local history services that are the 5 whys. Why do you need to tell this story now? Because this is because our interpretation up to this point of this story has been one-sided. Well, why? Because we don't have the other perspective. We don't have the other side of the story. Well, why? Because we haven't reached out to the community who has that side of the story. Well, why? Because we haven't worked to develop the relationship, or we let the relationship fall to the side. So think about that. Go to the 5 whys. Very often by the time you get to the 5th why, or when to stop the whys when you have kind of circled back around. But very often using that 5 whys technique gets you to that really deeper point. It gets you to that place where you say, oh, so here's what we need to do. And then you go back and you build on that and you answer those questions. So I would say it's really important to answer these questions, and it's really important to know why you are choosing to change your interpretation or choosing to tell that difficult story now. Ultimately, what you want to do is move your visitors and your staff and volunteers toward a point of understanding. How does telling the difficult story connect your visitors to a larger human story? What are our common threads? Where are our differences, but where are the commonalities in our experiences or feelings? Where are there opportunities for real contemplation and conversation? Okay, so we have the program, we have the panel, they're talking about it, but about the difficult history. They're telling a different side of the story, but look for opportunities for real conversation, the deeper conversation, the conversation that sometimes makes telling the difficult story even a little bit harder. And then how do we make safe spaces for our audiences, for our staff, for our volunteers? We acknowledge that this is difficult. We acknowledge that we need to tell the story, but how do we create safe spaces so those real conversations and real contemplation can take place? It's very important when you are working through this, when you're looking at moving toward understanding, when you're looking at telling more sides of the story, it's very important to avoid something called othering. So remember in the beginning when I said I have a master's in medieval Spanish literature? Years and years and years ago, pre-museum, one of the things that we talked about a lot in all kinds of literature that I was studying was this idea of the other, the person or community who is not you. One of the things to be aware of when you start doing that, sometimes what you're doing is you are creating an oppositional relationship. For example, I'm a white cisgendered middle class woman. Everyone who is different from me is not me. And that is true. However, what I may be implying in that statement in saying everyone who is different from me is not me is I may actually be setting myself up in opposition to them. I may be implying inferiority. I may be implying lesser value. So be wary of that, of kind of setting yourself apart from a community whose story that you're going to tell in a way that feels kind of implicitly negative or implicitly a value statement about that community. So I used to work in Montgomery County, Indiana, and these were two of the buildings I was responsible for. One is Speed Cabin. It was a site on the Underground Railroad. It's actually one wing of a cabin. It's the only part of Speed Cabin that exists anymore. It's been heavily reconstructed, moved several places, and I will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. It actually is on the grounds of Lane Place, which is a Greek Revival home. It's a historic house museum. It was built in 1845 by Henry Lane and his wife, Joanna. Henry Lane was a Civil War senator in Indiana. He actually kind of worked a deal. He was a Republican, worked a deal with the new Republican Party that he would run for governor of Indiana. And if he won, the Senate would appoint him, or the Indiana legislature would appoint him senator. And so he went to Washington. He was a governor for 3 days, was appointed senator, and headed off to Washington during the Civil War. When I got to Lane Place, one of the stories that was told was that Henry Lane was an abolitionist. He actually was not. He early on espoused gradual emancipation with colonization to Africa. He never fully, well, he didn't embrace abolition. He, in his experience and in his words, very often abolitionists were doing something that's illegal, and there were legal means to end slavery. He felt very strongly that slavery was wrong, that it was morally wrong, it was economically stupid, and he thought it should end, but he didn't think that what abolitionists were doing was the way to end slavery. So when I got there, the story was that he was an abolitionist. I worked to change that story. I worked with other folks to start to talk about Henry Lane and sort of his viewpoints, which, you know, were problematic. The idea of a gradual emancipation, the idea of colonization to Africa, that were bad, that were wrong, that moved beyond problematic. At the same time, I was working on an interpretation of the Speed Cabin. So if you look at Lane Place, it is Greek Revival. A lot of people see that, and I can't tell you how often people said, oh, it's like Gone with the Wind. When Speed Cabin was moved to the grounds of Lane Place, it unfortunately was put to the side and behind Lane Place proper. And so we did have a fair number of people who asked, is that where the slaves live? And then we had to talk about slavery and Indiana and all sorts of things that brings up when you're talking about enslaved people in states, in free states. We also talked about the Underground Railroad and the part the Speed Cabin played in that. I wanted to know more about that. And so I started to ask, when I was new to the organization, I started to ask folks what they knew about the history, who I could go to find out more about Speed Cabin and the Underground Railroad in Montgomery County, Indiana. I was referred to an older white lady, Martha. Martha had worked for a very long time to develop relationships in the African-American community in Montgomery County. Martha was older. She wasn't as active as she had been. And when I approached Martha, Martha said, I will introduce you to Vicki. And when you develop a relationship with her, if you develop a relationship with her, if she learns to trust you, then she will introduce you to other folks in the African-American community. And once you build that relationship, once you build that trust, they may or may not feel comfortable telling you the stories of the community, of Speed Cabin, what the community oral histories are and stories are around Speed Cabin and the Underground Railroad and indentured people in this community. So I worked to develop that relationship. I had to prove that I would listen, and I had to prove that I would hear, and I would begin to add information into the interpretation of the Speed Cabin. One gentleman that I talked to said, you know what would be great? If we could move the cabin back to its original site. He said, I remember when it was moved from its original site. And he said, they told us that we weren't taking care of it, that we were just letting it fall down. The they in that story was the municipal government of the county. The us was the African-American community. He said, and then they moved it to a public park and they watched it fall apart. And then they asked if the Historical Society would take care of it, and it was moved to the grounds of Lane Place. And he said, and it is being taken care of, but we don't have it anymore. And ultimately, wouldn't it be great if it was given back to our community? So that was sort of always one of my dreams, that we could move it back to where it belonged, and that we could make it right with the African American community and this evidence of their history. It originally was behind the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the congregation of that church worked with the white owners of the Speed Cabin to hide freedom seekers. So I left before that could happen, but I listened, and I acknowledged that that was hard, and I acknowledged that it wasn't okay to have taken the history away from a community instead of working with the community to preserve it. And then the relationship of trust was there, and we began to have many more conversations. And at this point, the Montgomery County Historical Society is having more frequent conversations with the African American community. Vicki is on the board, and so they are working at building a transformational relationship with the community in that small central Indiana, mostly rural county. When you're working in situations like that, I was very aware of my role as a representative of the Montgomery County Historical Society. I was very aware of the privilege that I had in being the executive director of the Historical Society. I was aware of the history of my organization and its relationships with communities throughout the county. It was important for me because it's also where I lived. It's where my kids went to school. It was important for me to recognize when I was acting as a representative of the organization and when I was acting as a private citizen. Fortunately for me, my feelings in both areas dovetailed. They were very connected. They were the same. That may not always be the case for your staff and volunteers. However, it was very important for me to acknowledge that there are any differences in my responses, to acknowledge I am here as a representative of the Historical Society, or I am here as Tamara Hemmerlein, private citizen of Montgomery County. You need to focus on being open to civil conversations, even if you don't agree. If somebody says something that you say, this is wrong, you can't say that, you can't think that. Be open to a civil conversation about that. Work to move conversations forward in productive ways. Learn de-escalation techniques, and understand sometimes you may need to walk away from the situation. That may mean you walk away for a little bit. You need to gather yourself. You need to think, okay, I am a bundle of anxiety and stress and anger at this point, and I need to walk away. That may be for a short period of time. It may be for a longer period of time, but be willing to acknowledge when you need to walk away. And know, personally, is there a point at which you are willing to fall on your sword? As an individual, as a representative of your organization, where is the point where you say, I'm not going to be part of this anymore? Or if this change doesn't happen, I cannot in good conscience be part of this. So know where your personal willingness is and where your personal lines are and where you will be willing to fall on your sword. So you're going to need to know, it's helpful to know how to de-escalate tense situations. Think about the potential conflicts before you enter the situation. Go back to that list of concerns because that may give you some ideas of what some potential tension or where potential tension may happen. Know the signs that a situation is becoming tense and may escalate. Look for changes in physical stance, tone of voice, changes in topic focus. So, you are talking about, in Indiana, you're talking about the fact that slavery wasn't happening in Indiana, but indentured servants were. That, free people of color could only stay in Indiana after a certain point if they paid a bond and a certain number of white land-owning males signed for them. So you're trying to talk about that, and then somebody brings up something that is happening in the current situation, and is doing it in a way that feels aggressive or feels tense to you. Be aware of that. Here are some de-escalation techniques. Really do what you can to calm the situation down, because ultimately what you're trying to do with your visitors is bring them to a point of understanding, bring them to that point of reconsideration. And one of the ways to do that is to de-escalate the situation for everyone and then have the conversation. I'm going to buzz through the other slides so we have some time for questions. So this is just a statement that the Jody Blankenship, the president and CEO of the Indiana Historical Society, made. History is critically important. It has the power to unite us in our ongoing desire to build a better future. By listening, learning, and striving to understand, we will continue to hold conversations about our history and how that history has shaped our current world. Without change, our state, nation, and society will not be able to overcome the weight of its own violent and racist history. And one of the ways to do that is to be willing to interpret difficult history. Do have a couple of our recent collecting initiatives here. One is documenting COVID-19 in Indiana, and the other one is listening to the voices of protest. Both of those have elements of difficult history, and those are things that as the Indiana Historical Society, we have to take into account when we begin using those collections, when we begin actively telling the story of 2020. So here's what I hope you take away from the webinar. I hope that when you leave, you will take it upon yourselves to learn more about how to tell diverse and inclusive stories, examine and acknowledge your own biases, think about how you can begin to interpret difficult history at your organization, and make a plan for developing transformative relationships with your community. So now, questions.
All right, so Tamara, we do have one question that came in the Q&A section about halfway through the webinar, but I figured I'd hold it to the end. So the question is, You describe collections as neutral, but I would add that they can represent a one-sided history that one part of the community preserved. I would describe collections, sorry, there's a word missing. I would describe collections as currently biased towards white history. Thoughts?
So what I would say with collections, so when I say collections should be neutral, kind of what I mean, and I don't know that neutral is actually the best word for it. What I mean is when we are telling a story, when we're collecting objects, images, stories, we need to be aware that we need to collect all sides of those stories. We need to collect, if we are collecting a Black Lives Matter sign, then we need to collect an All Lives Matter sign. As an organization, we may decide that we are going to interpret or we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, and we're going to take a stand. But what we need to do is make sure that we're collecting all sides of the story, not just the sides we agree with, not just the sides that feel more comfortable to us or feel less risky to us. And then as an organization, what we can do is say, as an organization, based on what we know, based on the stories that we collected, based on the objects we collected, here is how we're going to interpret that. And here is the side we're going to fall on in that interpretation. But our collections need to show more than just one side. So that we have those multiple perspectives to draw from. And then as an organization, we can decide what our stance is going to be, where that falls within our mission and where that falls within the reliable information and history that we have gathered. I hope that helped answer that question.
So that was the only question we had waiting in the queue. So if you have any more questions, type them in the Q&A or the chat.
Well, if anybody is doing that, here are the resources that I used. I relied very heavily on the Interpreting History series from Rowman and Littlefield, and also information from, roughly a gajillion webinars and conference sessions, especially this year. So here are some links to the things that I listened and learned and thought about a lot. And then here is my contact information. If you have any other questions and want to contact me, if you want to know more about the resources I used, the sort of list of webinars and things like that, or if you have any questions about anything that I've mentioned in this webinar, please contact me. I am happy to talk.
All right, you've got a couple more questions. One is, as a publicly funded entity, for example, the city's Arts and Culture Center, what are the best strategies to neutrally address difficult stories and encourage approval of potentially contentious objects? To clarify, this is an internal city management approval is what they're looking for. And just so you know, neutrally is in quotes.
So I think one of the things to do is go back to those questions that I had. Why are we telling this story now? Why are we changing our interpretation now? Why are we collecting these objects now? Come up with good answers to those questions. I think very often, and we go into a board or we go into the city council and we say, here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to do it. I think sometimes we don't say, here's why we're going to do it. And I think one of the things also to look at and think about is look externally when you're answering those questions. Talk about how it benefits the community. Talk about how telling these stories and collecting all of these objects will benefit the community now and in the future. I think knowing why we're doing something and being able to articulate why we're doing something is very, very important, and can help in those conversations. I would say also in those conversations, know what your biases are. When I had to go in front of municipal bodies, I had to sometimes breathe deep, because I would think, well, they don't care about history. I'm going in there and I'm going to have to make this case, and they don't really care about history. So what I had to do was step back from that and say, here's how they've kind of indicated that they don't care about history, or here's how they've indicated that they care about history. So how can I go in and have a good conversation with them about this? So I also had to check my own biases and my own points of resistance.
So there's another question. So it's been my interpretation from the museums are not neutral statement that moving to tell more concentrated stories of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQIA+ stories swings to be more neutral. Is collecting a Black Lives Matter sign with an All Lives Matter sign continuing the collecting to the white right versus shifting to a larger historical neutral?
Wow. So no, that's a really, really good question. And it's a packed question. I would say that one of the things to think about is how are you going to, if you collect, the Black Lives Matter sign and the All Lives Matter sign, how are you going to interpret them? How are you going to use them? What is your interpretive stance going to be? What is the story you're going to tell going to be? And I would say, I would keep falling on the side of, let's collect. We need to collect all parts of the story, but we can take a stance as an organization. So, decide where your risks are, decide what you want the impact to be. What do you want? How do you want to affect your community as an organization? And then use the objects to tell that story, use the objects to move that forward. And museums don't have to be neutral. Often museums shouldn't be neutral. There are instances where perhaps museums should be neutral, but really think about it and really have those conversations, and be very, very clear on the story you want to tell and what that story, how that story will impact and benefit your community. So just so you know, these questions are going to keep me up tonight, everybody.
And they will. All right, we're all clear of questions right now, so unless someone has another.
All right. So I want to thank you all for attending the webinar. I want to thank you for your really good questions. Oddly, I want to thank you for my sleepless nights, because these questions are important, and I don't have all of the answers. And certainly any answer I've provided has not been perfect, but I want to thank you very much for being here today, and for your questions, and for the work that you do in your organizations. So thank you very much, and stay well.